Welcome to Securely Speaking, your go-to podcast for all things governance, identity, security, and compliance. I'm Moritz, the head of marketing here at Integralis, and I'm excited to dive into another insightful episode with you. Without further ado, let me hand over to our hosts, Quinton, Hughes, and Almero Steyn, as they guide us through today's discussion.
Welcome to Securely Speaking, episode 3. It's been a long time coming. We had a good break, and then we got busy with the start of the year, but we're glad to be back. Hello, Quinton. Hope you're doing well.
Can't believe it's March already. Wow.
It's March already. I was talking to my wife earlier today and realized that the school term is finishing next week. So that's
that's crazy.
The first term's done. It's great to be back. We had a really nice discussion last time. We were talking about frameworks, and we had a lot of feedback from a lot of people asking questions about it and engaging with the topic. So on the back of that,
I think we discussed the Process Plus framework. We touched on Zero Trust frameworks, and it was a good discussion.
We had a different. So we talked about the two frameworks, but we had a different session a little while ago where we talked to a whole set of universities, also regarding Zero Trust. And one of the things that came up in this session, as well as the session that we had on frameworks, is kind of this positioning of where does IGA fit into this whole world of security.
People seem to, there's a lot of confusion around where it fits in, right? Difference between IAM, IGA, Identity Fabric, PIM.
But I think we even touched on it in the first conversation we had in Securely Speaking episode 1, where the conversation came up regarding who owns IGA. The same conversation I see comes up when we talk to CISOs or to security teams or to governance teams regarding, okay, but hang on, where does all of these components that sit in this fabric, and maybe that's a good place to start, is to define this fabric a little bit, but where does all this sit? And I think the short answer is, cat out of the bag, is typically it doesn't sit within one team. Even if it falls under the purview of the CISO, sometimes there's multiple teams and multiple stakeholders that own different technology components that sit in this world. And that, I think, is what creates confusion, is oftentimes companies want to look for one person or one set of technologies or one platform that does all of this. And it just simply doesn't exist. I think vendors also tried to create one. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, this concept of the identity fabric, the pure definition of a fabric is a bunch of parts woven together, right, to make the sum of all these parts to make a solution, to make a fabric. And in this case, IGA sort of sits smack bang in the middle as a small component of the bigger identity fabric in your organization. And I think that's why there might be some confusion around the identity fabric and where does it fit in with regards to PKI, multi-factor authentication, identity providers, PAM, PIM, SIM solutions. People get confused. They don't know where this fits into the organization. But in actual fact, the identity fabric is the sum of all of these components. That's what gets That's what this is all about, right? And your IGA solution might sit smack bang in the middle between all these different components within your identity fabric.
I think the interesting thing is depending on which vendor you speak to and which technology area you speak to, you might get different perspectives where somebody tells you, authentication sits in the middle of this. So I think if we step 2 steps back, let's kind of define where we're coming from. I think you're correct in saying that the identity fabric is a paradigm. It's a concept that says there is a multitude of different services that comes together to create this unified tapestry that allows for authentication, for authorization, and for auditing of access for whether it's employees or third parties or anybody entering the organization. And if you layer frameworks on top of that, then you have this discussion of, okay, well, Zero Trust extends that fabric by putting principles in place to say, okay, well, let's assume that we trust nobody that's coming into this fabric. And we put tools and processes in place to make sure that when somebody comes in, we verify who they are, we verify their device and we verify what they're trying to access. So I think if you talk to an authentication provider, they'll say, no, zero trust is the center of the identity fabric. I think selfishly, maybe this is our blind spot, but the way that we think about it is that none of these services make any sense, and you can't configure policy on any of these services if you don't know who the person is, and you don't know where they fit into the organization and what they're trying to do.
And I think also, I mean, the idea or the concept that one component within the fabric will solve all your problems is untrue. It is impossible to have a single vendor, single solution solve all your problems or solve your cybersecurity challenges, really. That notion is gone, doesn't exist. There's no such thing as the golden tool to solve all your problems, unfortunately. It's the cohesiveness and the integration between all these components that forms the basis of your fabric.
But I sometimes feel badly for a customer that has to try to, well, I'm a customer as well. I mean, I sit with this challenge daily with audits that we go through, third-party audits with our vendors and companies that we are a service provider to. But it's a difficult challenge. It's a difficult challenge to try to decide which tool to put into which little block in this tapestry that you're trying to weave. And I think something that makes it even more difficult is that many of the vendors are trying to kind of branch out into other areas. So you have, traditional PAM vendors like CyberArk, for instance, or Beyond Trust, that now put workflow processes in place to manage privilege access. But now if you manage privilege access, then how difficult is it really to manage identities? And then, how difficult to manage, this and that? And kind of you have these little overlaps. And I think it's not that these tools fit into nice little blocks. They fit into general blocks and then they overlap like a Venn diagram like crazy. So how do you help a customer to navigate this? So if you're sitting with a customer and the customer says, but okay, hang on, we do all our request management through ServiceNow, so I don't need your workflow processes. And we do all our authentication through AD, so we don't need your central identity store. Why do I need IGA? Is it just an audit requirement? Why do I need this?
I think that's a good question. And it really boils down to governance aspect of it, right? So we've spoken previously about identity and access management solutions, identity lifecycle management solutions, and all of these tools and components might do little parts of this, but where they generally
Quinton,
lack
sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I think kind of just define those two. Like you talk about identity and access and identity governance, and oftentimes people use those interchangeably. So what's the difference between those two in the context of your sentence?
Exactly. Identity and access management is really providing somebody with access privileges or giving them a mechanism of requesting and approving this access and then automating the provisioning part of it. Where the difference comes in when you talk about identity governance solutions, that literally that word governance, the audit and compliance and the governance of why did they get this access, who approved that access, when was that done, and showing an auditor the full audit trail of that process, having a specific policy enforced in a governed way. That's where the main difference comes in, right? I had a discussion the other day with a customer. They were saying, well, why do we need this IGA tool? Because I've got 10 guys who can manually go and create accounts and disable accounts when needed. People tend to think that IGA tools in this identity fabric is just there for automation purposes. And really, they forget about this small word or this governance word in your IGA solution, right? Governance is where that is the main key difference between your IGA solutions and your access management solutions. And yes, Beyond Trust, CyberArk, even Ping and Okta and these tools, they all start moving into this gray area of governance. Yeah. From an identity provider or an access management provider, they also start doing governance. Really, they're doing governance in their environment or in their sphere, in their services. Microsoft's doing the same thing with Entra ID governance. So But an identity governance platform looks at this from a central perspective throughout your organization, and it applies governance controls and aspects and audit controls and policies around throughout your entire landscape, not just within the IGA platform itself. And I think that's the key difference for customers to take into account, right? If you look at SAP, they've got serious governance controls within SAP itself, the GRC modules. But again, that's focused around SAP. Active Directory's got some controls in place. Azure's got controls in place, AWS and so forth. But within your identity fabric, if you stand back and look at your entire landscape, how do you apply governance controls around all your systems throughout? And that's where your IGA platform really fits in and comes into play.
That's a good point, actually.
Well, that's my opinion in any case.
No, definitely. I think another interesting thing that I, with my background from a more IAM, so I mean, I shouldn't say how long I've been doing this, but in identity and access management, my focus in the tool sets that I've used in the past has always been kind of operationally focused, trying to provide efficiency and security. And governance was never something that was a big focus on the IAM side. Something that's interesting to me that differentiates a really good IGA solution and an IAM solution, yes, is this governance aspect, but there's also this world in the middle of proactively managing access based on policy. If you look at the mature IGA platforms, you see that they all have the concept of some kind of policy engine or role engine. And that was a big differentiator in my world when it comes to applying access. So simply speaking, if you have an IAM solution, and you can, if you talk about Azure AD Provisioning Service today, if you talk about MIM, if you talk about many other IAM platforms, they're fairly static in the way that access is controlled and assigned and implemented in the tool. So if you have this and you have this, then you should get that, that, and that. And these rules are fairly static in the way that you apply them. Where governance platforms introduces this idea of a policy engine that says, if I use context and I define 30 or 40 rules, hundreds of pieces of permission gets assigned. And the ability for an organization to extend that rapidly was a big game changer when I looked at the difference between these platforms. So I think if I look at the IAM world, it's very operational focused. It definitely gives you automation, and it definitely gives you some security, making sure people get removed. But if you go back to the Identity Process Plus framework, if you start looking at aligning your access to business processes and then governing those processes and reporting on those processes, that was a big departure in the difference between IAM and IGA. And then this role engine and all this policy that you implement then gives you the governance aspect that you now can actually apply governance on it. That was a big differentiator in my mind when I looked at the two platforms.
Yeah, exactly. Role-based access control and how that's modeled against your organization. Huge. And dynamically maintains and updates itself to ensure people have the right access, to ensure that access is constantly being reviewed by the correct people and so forth. I mean, that is absolutely one of the key differentiators between your IGA platforms and your generic IAM platforms. But if you look at the identity fabric things, I mean, one of the other things that we spoke about, talk about privileged identity management or privileged access management, authentication services, identity providers. The other day, a customer said to me, but what's the difference between an identity provider and an IGA platform? You know, people keep confusing those two as well. But again, in the fabric as such, you can't just use one of these services. You need an identity provider that gives you access to multi-factor authentication, regional login checks, and all that stuff. And you need an IGA platform to focus on all the IGA role-based access controls and things that we spoke about now. You need PKI, you need authentication services, you need privileged identity management services, and this forms your fabric, really. It's not just one or the other. It is a complete combination of all of these. How these tools integrate and talk to each other is the next challenge that organizations sit with. It's the sharing of contextual information between your IGA platform, between your authentication platform, your identity provider, and so forth. And I think that's part of the challenges that organizations.
I think that's where this conversation of control plane comes up again, where many vendors will say, but I am the control plane for the whole fabric.
Exactly.
And I think that's very difficult. It's even difficult for an IGA solution to say that it's the control plane. I think it's the one that has the furthest reach. If you're talking about, you had a great concept to say, well, if you do governance over this entire fabric. So if you have a platform that manages the access into privileged access management and all the systems and the identity store where people get authenticated, or multiple stores, then the one system that has the most context is probably the IGA system. But even that doesn't have all the context, because it doesn't see stuff like incidents happening and impossible travels, and it doesn't have context of devices. One of the conversations I wanted to touch on that always comes up is when we have conversations with people about IGA, is they ask us, well, where do I see in the IGA system what people did with that access? And then invariably we have to say, no, that's not the scope of an IGA system. A SIEM system that looks at all the events across, in the same way that an IGA system looks at all the access that people have, your SIEM system has to look at all the activity and the logs where people are using their system to try to find correlation to say, oh, this is what's happening. So there's already this weird, cutoff point where you say, yes, we look at the access, the people, we look at the access they have, but an IGA platform is not going to give you visibility in what they're doing with that access. That's a different part of the fabric. That's SIEM.
I think it's got a lot to do with perspective and from which perspective you're coming. So the notion that a single control plane will give you visibility into your entire organization across everything that you want to see, that's impossible. And I think if you come from an operational perspective, if you're the operations manager, you might have a different requirement from information that you want to see. You want to see automation, you want to see provisioning errors, you want to see how the system is functioning and what's working and what's not working. But if you come from a security audit perspective or a risk officer perspective, you want to look at risk events. You want to look at elevated access that hasn't been revoked. You want to look at risk in your organization. So your control plane will be very much from a risk management perspective. What are some of the other ones?
If you have the SOC, you're looking at management. Incidents.
Exactly. Yeah. From an ITIL perspective, you want to see how long incidents took to be resolved or how long requests took to be approved and so forth, right? So really, I think an IGA platform provides you the governance and risk control plane with some visibility into automation and provisioning and so forth, whereas your PAM solution will give you the control plane of what you would want to see from a privileged access management perspective. But the integration between all of these makes it visible, gives you the visibility across your enterprise, but not to the depth that you might see in each one of these components in your identity fabric. And I think that's important. We've got big organizations who have tools in place such as ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a contested or a highly discussed topic usually because that's where people do access requests. That's your ITIL process, right? That's where they go for logging requests that for things that don't work in their environment, their keyboard broke or their Outlook's not working. But that's also where they go to request a new service. And then if you think about it, where does the request and approval process sit if you have a governance platform? Now ServiceNow is starting to build some governance controls into their request access process because that's what the customers want. If you've got an IGA platform, they will also do that. The IGA platform also does that. So really the customers are like, okay, but hang on a second. Am I now supposed to move all my users over to use the IGA platform for request and access management? Because that's where I want governance to be applied. That's where I want segregation of duty to be checks to be completed. That's where I want violation management to be done. So the integration of these platforms and where users do what, your single control plane, that stays a challenge, and that's very organization specific. And again, like I said, it depends on what your perspective is and with what you want out of that platform through which control plane you're going to have to look at it.
That's very valid. I think that's very valid. I think I want to start wrapping this up, but just before we do that, you're making such a good point, and I can see the counterpoint to the one that you're making is that if you're focused on identity processes, then you would gravitate towards using your IGA platform for many of the service requests. But your IGA platform is not going to be the place where you log a service request for a new phone or for a new laptop. So you have this split where both of these platforms provide, or many of these tools provide these things, but it's the customer's choice about how they want to automate and integrate these two that's ultimately going to kind of determine what their fabric looks like. I want to wrap this up. So I want to kind of try to put things. I always try to summarize things in my head. So if we look at a 10,000 foot view of identity fabric, and we say that there's probably different opinions about how many things sit there. But if I say, let's try to help our customers here to kind of categorize stuff into a few buckets, then I can see that you obviously have identity providers that help you authenticate. That's things like Azure AD, Active Directory, Azure AD, and different identity providers. You always need those. You will definitely need something like an IGA platform that automates the life cycle and the access and the governance about who has what access and what they're using it for. Kind of on the heels of the identity provider is this, I don't know what you want to call it, but let's call it your zero trust provider. Now, this could be tools that help you to manage identity verification, device verification, access logging, conditional access, stuff like that. So you have tools like Duo and Ping and Okta and Microsoft Entra. But then you would also need to check activity. So we're going to have to look for a SIEM provider like Splunk or Azure Sentinel that combines all the logs. You would definitely need a PAM solution, I think, because none of these platforms really does PAM to the extent that something like Beyond Trust or CyberArk would do it. And then you obviously have network providers and all kinds of other things. I don't know, on the identity and access and authorization side, do you see that I'm missing something? What tools am I missing here?
I think
categories of tools am I missing?
No, I think that list can probably go on and on forever. There's going to be a lot of components and tools in the organization. I think it's important to understand that the answer is not a single tool. The answer is how these tools share information securely and what contextual information they need to share to give the audience of that platform the purview that they need, the information that they need with the perspective from where they're coming from. And standardizing this integration in your fabric and putting the rules in place of what information is shared between these platforms, I think that's a good start for an organization. As soon as you realize that you can't do everything out of one platform, although service providers and vendors might tell you that because they want to sell you that tool, it's not going to be one tool solves all your problems and one tool will give you the control plane that you want to see everything throughout your organization with. It's going to be different tools. And I think the sooner the organizations accept that and they start using tools for what they are really good at and what they are purposely built for, instead of trying to use one tool for everything, that already starts making it easier. And it's your first step in maturing your identity fabric, right? Getting to a high maturity level of an identity fabric is utilizing SIEM tools for SIEM functionality. It's utilizing identity providers for identity provider functionality and using it to the best of their ability, integrating these to get you the high level of risk mitigation in your organization. That's key.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that's a perfect way to kind of summarize the conversation. Thank you. Thanks for the conversation, Quinton. I really enjoy the conversations that we have. We had a few suggestions for other topics, so we'll go through those and figure out what the next one is. But I think until then, that puts a nice bow on it to say that there are different tools for different functions. I think I want to encourage people to still go and check out the link for the Identity Process Plus download. That framework definitely helps you to contextualize a lot of the things that I think we've talked about today. And then I think also there are a few different models out there for identity fabric. Even though it's a paradigm, there are models out there. So I think if people overlay Identity Fabric and Identity Process Plus, I think this picture might make a lot of sense for them to try to put little blocks in place for themselves and to put tools in place on top of those. So I think with that, that's all from my side. It was a great conversation.
Thanks for the chat.
No,
thanks for the chat. I think it's always tough to have these conversations because it seems confusing and it seems like a lot of information, but really it boils down to understanding that the fabric is a combination of all the tools in your environment to protect your environment, right? I think we've had a lot of these discussions with customers, so we've tried to make it a bit more clear, and I hope the audience enjoyed what we said and they have a bit more understanding, or if they are more confused, I mean, you guys must ping us and let us know. Let's see where we go from here. But I like having these discussions. Every time we have it, it sort of unlocks new ideas and new ways of trying to explain this. So,
well, thanks for the discussion, Quinton. Everybody listening, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. If you like the content and the discussion, please, if you're watching on YouTube, drop us a like there. If you're watching on Spotify or listening on Spotify, drop a follow. Any questions that you'd like to provide us, send them to us. We'll be happy to answer them or have a discussion about them in a follow-up session. But until next time.
See you next time. Thanks, guys.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, leave a like and subscribe to stay tuned for our upcoming sessions. We'd also love to hear from you, so leave a comment in the comment section, or alternatively, reach out to us on www.integralis.coza/contact us. See you next time.